Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How's everyone doing? I literally can't even say that with a straight face anymore. Because if you have any fucking empathy or soul at all, you are feeling nauseous with rage. Say it with me. Nauseous with rage. Now tell me, is disappearing students who write op-eds that the Secretary of State doesn't agree with, is that a sign of a healthy society or not? Having trouble figuring that out. But I'll tell you what, I have no trouble figuring out how good today's episode is, because it's great. Today is Jeffrey Lewis. If you don't know who Jeffrey is, I'm going to read you his bio right now. Originally from the Lower East Side of New York City, musician and cartoonist Jeffrey Lewis has bounced back and forth between his two loves, comics and music, for most of his professional life. As a cartoonist, Jeffrey's longest project was Fuff, F-U-F-F, which he wrote and drew from 2004 to 2020. He also created Revelations in the Wink of an Eye, parentheses, My Insane Musings on Watchmen, From Conspiracies to Stupidities, end parentheses. And his most recent project is called Statics, which he started writing and drawing in 2022. As a musician, Jeffrey began as part of the New York anti-folk scene that would play at the Sidewalk Cafe in the 1990s. He released his first album, When Madman Was Good, version 1 in 1997, and 4 years later, he was signed to Rough Trade, who released his first quote-unquote official album, The Last Time I Did Acid, I Went Insane, which is a fantastic title. Since then, he's released over 24 albums and EPs, and his latest, the even more freewheeling Jeffrey Lewis, just came out on Blang Records, and folks, it's a banger! I can't remember whether I read Jeffrey's comics or listened to Jeffrey's music first, but I was about to say consuming. I hate that fucking word. I have been enjoying, how's that? Finding meaning in Jeffrey's art for a long time now. And this is a great episode. I don't think Jeffrey and I were ever... I'm not sure how to finish that. I just want to say, I don't think it was a warm conversation, but it was very interesting, talking a lot about his socialist upbringing and what that meant, and we got into a tangent about why one might have difficulty making progressive art in the upper echelons of show business. That was really interesting. Yeah, Jeffrey's a great dude, very thoughtful, and I hope you like this episode. Coming up on the show, we've got Anders Nilsson, who I do mention in this episode, who I talked to earlier in the day. But again, if this is your first time listening to the show, I have said this for the past couple weeks. The fires threw off the schedule. So Anders Nilsson is coming up. Daniel Warren Johnson, speaking of comics. Tina Halliday from Sheer Mag, that was really cool. John Davis of The Folk Implosion. Oh, and this is just the other day. I talked to Kelly Sue DeConnick. Brilliant comics writer. That was fantastic. So stay tuned for those. But for now, let's talk to Jeffrey. This is a very weird coincidence, but do you know Anders Nilsson at all?
Not personally. I'm a fan.
Yeah. I talked to him earlier today, and his grandparents were communists, and his father grew up in a communist, not a communist household, but those are the beliefs being promulgated there. And I was reading that you come from kind of a socialist family. I don't know if that's true or not. I can't always assume that what I've read online is true.
Yeah, definitely same situation, red diaper baby of multiple generations of communists, and basically in all directions, both sides of my parents' families and their families, which I don't know where Anders Nilsson grew up, but I think in New York City, certainly, there was quite a lot of that culture. Especially prior to World War II. And I think among certain circles of Jewish left-wing intellectuals, it was uh, probably more common than not to have uh, extended families that were communists and communist supporters, and it was almost yeah. I think nowadays the fact that it's considered this rarity and this thing like, oh, your family were communists, so your grandparents were communists, and their parents. I think at a certain time that was just a very sizable chunk of culture, which was probably part of why the McCarthyism era of the 1950s was so extreme in its efforts to kind of stamp that out, and it took such drastic measures because it was so widespread. And interesting. I recently read the memoir of Suze Rotolo, Bob Dylan's first girlfriend in New York. That and it I had bought that book a few months ago to give to my mom as a gift for her to read, because I know that Suze Rotolo also came from a communist family and was raised by communist parents and moved to the Greenwich Village in the late 50s, early 60s from Queens, and that is very similar to my mom's life story, moving to Greenwich Village in the late 50s from Brooklyn, coming from a communist political background and being involved in left-wing politics in the Greenwich Village folk scene in the early 60s. So I knew that my mom would relate a lot to Suze Rotolo's memoir.
It's interesting. You can see what's happening now in the way that the fascists are basically just trying to erase history, and how they've, been doing that for a long time. But like, you see the immediate kinds of things, and you realize just how much, like, when fascists really get control, whether it's kind of like the McCarthyite type people, how destructive they are and how much history they erase. So that when I was a kid, I grew up in the Reagan era. I'm a little younger than you. I grew up in the Reagan era, and all this stuff was already erased. Maybe you would hear something about the blacklist or something like that, but you didn't really know any of this stuff. And you didn't know any of this kind of history. Maybe when you are an adult, you get to hear about Jewish socialist camps that kids would go to, like summer camps and things like that.
Like this one.
Like that one, that your whole Tales of Wo Chi Cha. Did you go Wo Chi Ka?
Yeah, this was just like a thing of my parents' generation, a kind of camp that they would have gone to. I ended up with this book probably from, maybe this was on my grandmother's bookshelf, but a friend of mine from England, from Scotland, was in town at some point a few months ago, and she was researching this kind of topic of these socialist camps. And I was like, oh yeah, my parents went to those camps. Everybody they knew went to those summer camps as kids. And I even have this book about one of the camps. But there were many of these camps. And it was just, summer camp, sleepaway camp. For my parents, at those camps, they would often have people visiting, like Paul Robeson, for example. The singer would go and perform for the kids at the summer camps. And my mom has like an autographed Paul Robeson record from that. So yeah, that's just because you mentioned those summer camps, and I happened to be sitting next to this bookshelf. Pulled it out. How
is this stuff transmitted to you when you're a kid? Are you just kind of in it, and so you kind of just by osmosis absorb some things? Are politics presented to you in an organized way, like this is what we believe and you have your choice or whatever? How is this? How is your childhood kind of organized politically?
A lot of things were very much taken for granted, in the sense that I think my parents didn't really understand or like how much they were not preparing me for life in the context that I was finding myself in. I think that really feeds into my sense of alienation, or sense of not connecting to people or not being accepted by people, because I was raised, it almost is like the equivalent of being raised in a cult or a commune or something. Because, first of all, we didn't have any television in the house. It was, and the whole family perspective on things from whether it was my parents, my uncle, my aunts, my grandparents, my dad's parents, my mom's parents, my everybody was, all the books on the shelves were these, the works of Lenin and the, or even, and then the music, it was Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Paul Robeson, Joan Baez. All of this stuff was very left-wing activist stuff, and all of these books about, Mao Zedong or whatever. And like you said, even though you're a few years younger than me, you remember the 80s, and I was growing up as a kid in the 80s, which was so anti-60s and anti-communist that the culture, the counterculture, the hippie counterculture, as well as the kind of feminist and civil rights culture. And I mean, my uncle had gone to the South as part of the Freedom Riders, and my parents were both, they all lived a very counterculture 60s life in terms of the politics, in terms of the activism, and this communist perspective in which all the movies of the 80s, the communists were always the bad guys, even in the comic books, even in, I wanted G.I. Joe toys, but I was like not allowed to have G.I. Joe toys. I had to really fight to, all the other kids in my class were watching Red Dawn and Rambo and playing with G.I. Joe toys. And this was like very much like not okay in my household. And I didn't really understand why that should be the case. And that even extended to the kind of anti-mainstream, anti-capitalist way that I never had new clothes. I never had a haircut. Maybe my mom cut my hair. Everything was like hand-me-downs. My toys were just things that were found in the garbage or whatever. And I didn't realize until, even just looking at me now, I have this gap in my teeth. I never had braces. I just, in a certain way, was like being raised like an animal and then kind of thrown into this 80s culture. I was going to school with modern kids who had, Ataris and then Nintendos and VCRs, and they had watched all the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, and they were watching G.I. Joe cartoons. And of course, I loved all that stuff. I wanted very much to participate in that culture, and that stuff was very exciting to me. It was the 80s. There was nothing cooler than Schwarzenegger movies and G.I. Joe and all that's, and I craved it. I wanted a television very badly. But instead I had to just sit home and read comic books because that was like the only thing that was allowed. And, of course it would have been explained to me that it's very, the fact that Superman and Batman they're very kind of right-wing characters. They only beat up, small-time street burglars and crooks. But meanwhile, the big crooks are the corporations and I was constantly getting this kind of communist perspective fed to me from my parents that, all this pop culture is just like capitalist brainwashing junk. But it was just so terribly confusing to me because it was so completely different. Which is what drew me to being interested in it. The projects that I make, where I do these history of communism songs, these illustrated songs that I do in my concerts, which are kind of out of nowhere, where it's just like, okay, well, here's some of my songs, and now I'm going to show you some drawings and tell you about the history of communism in Vietnam. And it works as a kind of entertaining gimmick because it's just so wacky. But at the same time, I am literally just fascinated by what is the story here? Like, how come I was hearing such a different story growing up that the communists were the good guys, and everything around me in the 80s culture was that the communists were the bad guys. So I just wanted to know what happened? Like, who are these people? Who was Ho Chi Minh? Like, who was Mao Zedong? Who was Che Guevara? Like, what's the story here?
Yeah, it really takes so much effort. First of all, you have to kind of be, and I think as a parenthetical, probably because, or very obviously because of your parents, you were already kind of like wedged apart from mainstream culture. But if you're not, it takes an intense amount of effort to excavate reality from under the kind of capitalist propaganda that we get. And you know what, I'm a socialist, so I'm, obviously I have my own critiques of the system, and I don't know whether I am, I I don't know whether I would be okay with a very strict managed capitalism or if I want fully whatever. I actually don't know what I believe in that case. But to even get to the point where I am took, I would say, decades of work to kind of just like, oh, okay. And I was a philosophy professor. So like I even had training in how to do this kind of stuff. And it still took me a while to kind of think through the, oh, well, okay, so this is in this sitcom, look at the way the family is, and that is just reproducing these kinds of beliefs that distort reality and all this other, so on and so forth from there. But you had it from the beginning.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that people are able to come to that perspective on their own or put some of these dots together and get interested in these things. I don't know what that would be like because I'm coming from that all these things kind of being taken for granted and I didn't have to seek these things out. This was all the bookshelves were just of my parents' apartment are just stuffed with this stuff anyway. And I was just like, well, what is this? And when, some of the things that you're talking about, well, this reminds me of just very recently, I was on tour and we stayed at the home of this guy in Las Vegas who housed us for the night, who had been in the U.S. military. He was not coming from a left-wing perspective at all. He was actually stationed in Iraq, and he somehow he described himself as a communist. And I was like, how? That doesn't make any sense. And he just said, yeah, I never had any exposure to any of those ideas. I was raised, completely mainstream, and joined the army. But when I was there, actually, I was just noticing that it didn't make any sense. What were we doing there? The stories, the things that I was hearing from people that I was talking to, the way it just wasn't adding up. And I wanted to learn more about why things were like this. And somehow this guy just put himself on a path of education and read certain books, and it opened other doors to want to read other books. And now this guy I'm like, that is not supposed to, the U.S. military does not train and brainwash the people that it hires and trains to leave any possibility of them coming to that conclusion and reading those books and following that line of thinking into that kind of self-education. It blew my mind that this guy exists and that that's possible for people. Because like you're saying, you came to this stuff out of your own curiosity of wanting to educate yourself about things that you hadn't been taught about. And for me, I kind of came to it similarly. There's so much that I hadn't been taught about, but that was kind of handed to me on a silver platter by my upbringing, being like, oh, these people are actually heroic. That I wanted to know about it because of just being so confused by these differing perspectives. But it's certainly, you have to but the fact that somebody would just get curious and interested and start following that stuff on their own. But I guess there are these little breadcrumbs through culture, the way that maybe a 16-year-old might be like, who is that guy on that Rage Against the Machine t-shirt? Like, oh, right, Che Guevara, right. What is that? What does that mean? Like, let me read something about him. Let me find out. There's things that you can start picking up on, and if you're, to me, the stories are unbelievable, incredible stories. When I make these things that I perform at my concerts, I cannot believe that these stories are not exploited by the entertainment industry to, when I like this whole thing about being in the 80s, I was saturated with Vietnam War movies. It was the era of Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Hamburger Hill, et cetera, and not Apocalypse Now, Born on the 4th of July. It was an era of huge amounts of Vietnam movies, and I could have watched every single one of those movies and not learned one thing about the history of French colonialism in Vietnam, the history of, Vietnam's attempts at liberation in the 20th century. Like, I had to learn, once I started learning all of the backstory of it just on my own, just trying to educate myself, these stories struck me as so incredible that I couldn't wait to tell my audiences about this. I'm like, what are you? And the same thing with like learning about Chile, learning about Salvador Allende, learning about Victor Jara, learning about any one of these topics, Fidel Castro. I'm like, this is storytelling gold. These are incredible stories of bravery, of insane events, of totally unpredictable, weird things. I'm like, Steven Spielberg is just missing out on like the greatest stories that you could tell. These are the most exciting stories of good versus evil, of, it's like people are just going to go watch Star Wars and they don't even know that this other totally incredible story exists. I get to be the person that tells people about this. That's unbelievable. It's like this gift to me that nobody has done these stories in movie form. It's like, wait.
Well, let me tell you that, when I came out here to Los Angeles, the thought was, oh, I'm in the business. Okay, I get there's a business part of this, but at least, there is the art part, and I hear the stories of like Jack Warner and like, all these old school studio executives and studio heads who, they want to make a buck, but they also love movies and things like that. And then the more that I'm in it, I realize I'm not really in the business of telling stories. I'm in the business of juicing stock prices at this point. Like the paradigm shift has been so abrupt, especially with Netflix and streaming. So there are all of these incredible stories. People don't give a shit about telling them because it doesn't necessarily juice the stock price in a way. Like before, you could tell maybe you could tell a story from a left-wing perspective and make and do well at the box office and everyone would be happy. It's become very much, now you're just in the business of either making propaganda for the U.S. military. Like the U.S. military, there was an article I read a long time ago where it's just like, you wouldn't even believe the number of films that the U.S. military, were things you wouldn't even think that they would have their fingers in. They have their fingers in. But there's a reason why those stories aren't being told. And it doesn't do much for the stock price. The executives that are in charge of a lot of things, not all of them, but there are many of them who like are not interested in telling stories. They're interested in, it could have been blenders. It could have been vacuum cleaners. It's just that this is a little glitzier than that stuff. And so they went into show business and that's it. And it has changed a lot, even in the 8 years I've been out here.
Well, yeah, I always think that, I don't understand that aspect of the entertainment industry because I have these kind of stereotypical images of, oh, here's the corporate board meeting and they tell somebody they have to rewrite their script or something, but I don't know the reality of how that goes. But I do love the fact that the more underground mediums like, I don't know, song making, whether it's rap or country or rock or what have you, jazz or poetry or comic books or these forms of expression where you can just make whatever you're interested in. And there don't seem to be that many people interested in this stuff, even in those mediums. It's not as though, somebody like Jay-Z or whoever, Taylor Swift, Snoop Dogg, they could make an album about the history of socialism in Latin America or something, but they're not doing it. They're not interested in it. That's a mystery to me. Why it, like I mentioned, Steven Spielberg, any of these people, any filmmakers of any renown, great or small, could make any film that they want, I would imagine. Maybe they have to answer to some kind of corporate structure, investors, shareholders, or they won't get their films distributed, or I don't know what, but it still seems to me. It seems to me that if you have skills if you have entertainment skills, if you're a stand-up comic, who can stop you from saying you could talk about anything? And if you make it entertaining and engaging, then I don't think that there's a barrier. I just don't see people being interested in it. And I'm not interested in it to the extent that I want that to be the whole of my creative career. It's a small fraction of this kind of stuff that I'm making. I make a lot of other kinds of comic books and other kinds of songs, but it certainly is something that I'm interested in. And I think it's an incredible wealth of material that, if I can put it in an entertaining form where it is engaging and, maybe there's some humor to it. Maybe there's some interesting plot twists. Maybe there's some things that get people curious. There's a lot of great material there. I just don't know why. I don't know, when you're talking about Hollywood or you're talking about that aspect of the industry, it still seems to me that there's narrative gold there. There's a lot of stories.
100%. There was an article that came out, I think it was probably during 2020, during the kind of civil rights remix that was going on then, that was saying like Hollywood is leaving $50 billion on the table by not telling Black stories. You know, there'll be one, it's usually always like a story of like overcoming some kind of adversity. It's always, you know, if it's a Jewish story, it's always a Holocaust narrative. If it's a Black story, it's always slavery or Jim Crow or some kind of, you know, overcoming adversity type narrative, usually with the help of a white person. There's almost always, you know, like whether it's Schindler who's helping the Jews, it's never, not never, but most of the time it's never a story of building communities that fight back against powers. It's always, you know, a kindly white person.
Yeah, it's funny because I just recently, a few days ago, watched Mississippi Burning, which I his movie with Gene Hackman and Willem Dafoe as FBI agents who were investigating the disappearance of civil rights activists in the South in the 60s, based on the real. I thought it was going to be a little more factual about Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, a real life case of three people who were murdered by the Klan, and they were, you know, the local authorities in Mississippi were not investigating it properly because they're tied in with the Klan also. And I thought this movie was going to be a more factual telling of that historical event, but the movie was exactly as you described. It's more like, okay, well, here's like these white FBI agents who are the heroes of the story, and they're going to come sort this out. And it's like, you know, the Black community is in need of their official police action help kind of thing.
Yeah. So the thing is, you're right. There are stand-ups who can talk about these kinds of things. There are people working in comics, in music, but there are institutional barriers. So once you get past a certain level, and now someone at the top has to make a decision about the things you want to make, this stuff is like alien to them. They don't understand. If you come at things from a left-wing perspective, they don't understand what you're talking about. And they may not be curious enough. They may not care. I don't know. You know, I'm not going to assign why they don't know. I'm not going to assign a reason to that. I'm just going to say they don't understand it. And I know that for a fact because you talk to them and they kind of like furrow their brow and they're like, oh, okay. It doesn't resonate. And because it doesn't resonate to them, they therefore do not allocate the budget to telling those stories, even though it would probably resonate to tens of millions of people, minimum, if not more. That's it. It's really just institutional barriers. There's someone at the top who's just like, this doesn't make sense to me. They're usually a white person, usually always been wealthy. And that's it. There's more to it than that, but I think that's like the very basic dynamic that's at play.
Well, I guess maybe you know more about that end of things than I do. I just am. I can't figure out. I don't understand why the way that you've described it makes it sound like the more successful or the more powerful you are as an artist, the less power you have in doing what interests you because you're beholden to these investors or these structures. Whereas it would seem to me that the more powerful you are as an artist, the more it would liberate you to do whatever interests you without having to bend it to the desires of those other people. So I don't understand that aspect of it.
You're right, but I think this is going back to something that Chomsky said in Manufacturing Consent, Chomsky and Herman, and he said this in an interview, but I think he wrote it in Manufacturing Consent, where there are certain filters. So the kinds of people that would want to tell those stories don't get to those places of power. Like if Taylor Swift was someone who wanted to, and I'm not interested in her music, but there's no shade on her, but if she was someone who was interested in telling stories about the working class or left-wing perspectives or things like that, she would never have become Taylor Swift in the first place.
Well, I guess maybe there's something to be said for that. I don't know if can't be universally true. But I don't know. Are we going on a very long tangent, or
Yes.
is this what this interview is? Because I'm not planning on being here for 2 hours. I'm probably going to wrap this up, maybe around 6 or something.
No, this is an hour long. This is an hour
Yeah.
long and a
Okay.
very long
So,
tangent that we got onto because it was interesting, and I was like, all right.
yeah, there's a lot of things that I can yak about, and I have no problem yakking on, and I just don't know if I'm occupying this time in a way that is what you were hoping to do. Because this is a topic I can certainly keep talking about, but I wasn't sure if this is
Well, I like your work and I find it engaging. So that's, but I think the thing, if we want to get off of the tangent, the thing that I go back to was you grew up with these beliefs. You also grew up with the kinds of mass culture things that you were interested in. Whatever, G.I. Joe, Transform. When I was a kid, G.I. Joe, Transformers, really Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were the thing that came around in the later 80s, right?
Yeah.
All of these things in their way then make you want.
I'll show you my collection of original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics. These are the rare black and white originals because I was a little bit older. I was of the age where this was like the hot property, but before it became a mainstream thing, there was nothing cooler than the underground Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles original black and white comics, which I don't know if these are, I don't know what the value of these are nowadays. I think they were super valuable for a little while and then they probably dropped. But anyway, I was of the right age at the right time to for that to be the coolest thing in the world.
Yeah. But you're growing up with this kind of dichotomy or this contradiction where you believe you like both of these. I'm assuming that you weren't rebelling against your parents at all, that you the things that they were telling you made sense, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I mean, I wasn't rebelling against them politically or counterculturally because as a teenager, I did really very much want to know everything I could find out about the Rolling Stones, about the Beatles, about Bob Dylan, about, I wanted to know all the stuff of my parents' generation. I want, the whatever records they had on their shelves. They even had the first Fugs record, which was very different sort of thing. And that was something that they had just bought at a Fugs gig right here in the neighborhood. And that sort of Lower East Side culture and 60s counterculture was not something, I wasn't like I turned into a straight edge, shaved head, hardcore 80s punk as a way to rebel against my parents. It wasn't like I was, but I certainly rebelled against, at least for a time when you're, when you're a kid, when you're 10, you're 11, you're 12, that tribal, the difficulty of the social system of, and then you're in junior high and you really want to be like the other kids. You want to have the right kind of shoes, the right kind of shirts. You want to watch the same TV shows so you have something to talk about with them. It was just very painful to be this outsider. So I really rebelled against, I wanted all that stuff. I wanted the Nintendo. I wanted to watch RoboCop and all of that stuff, even though it was stuff that my parents, were very against.
Yeah. That's the thing that I'm curious about. How did you navigate that? Or did you just sit with that kind of alienation and pain and just all right, this is just my lot? Or did you bounce back and forth between things, sneak out to go see RoboCop at, I don't know what the movie theaters were in the 80s in New York, but all I remember when I lived there was I would go to the Angelica or the IFC Center. So
yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, I went for a few years very heavily into all of that stuff that my parents would have been against in terms, I got really into horror movies. I was, really into trying to buy clothes from the Gap and going to a barber to get a real haircut and wanting to watch all of the modern action movies and, Die Hard and all the cop movies and all the Schwarzenegger movies that, I did convince we did get a TV by the time I was 12, 13, and we did get a VCR. So for a few years in my life, I completely immersed myself in that regular mainstream 80s culture. I did get to watch all those movies. and watch a lot of TV. I watched TV all the time when I was, 14, 15. And then for some reason, I don't know why exactly, it didn't stick with me.
Hmm.
After a few years of being very immersed in that, I think it was kind of discovering 60s stuff that really made me like not be interested in the modern 80s stuff. By the time it was like 88, 89, 90, I had kind of discovered the Grateful Dead and Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin and all this stuff that was just so much more awesome to me than uh, whatever the modern bands were in the late eight, than In Excess or whatever the stuff was on the radio.
Sure.
uh, it was just like, oh, there's this whole other hidden world, which didn't really have any. I didn't think of it politically. It was just like the awesomeness of it was so much more awesome than. And it also related to discovering 1960s comic books because I was always into comic books from being a little kid, but I had never really gotten into. I had actually always hated what I thought of as the much cruder art of Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko. Um, but when I sort of discovered the psychedelic aspect of it, the way that it crossed over with the 60s music, the way that Country Joe and the Fish would mention Doctor Strange in a lyric, the way that, you know, Pink Floyd would use a little bit of a Marvel Comics artwork from the 60s on an album cover. The 60s comic stuff became very interesting to me. The psychedelic aspect of it, Jim Starlin and Jim Steranko, those all of that stuff kind of tied together as I
Yeah.
was discovering Cream and Sid Barrett, and it was just this. So at that point, I completely, basically unplugged and disinvested myself in this idea of getting haircuts, wearing new clothes, listening to modern 80s music, being interested in modern stuff at all. I just fell into this kind of 60s rabbit hole, that whole aesthetic, which I've really never left. The majority of music I listen to, the majority of the records in my collection is 60s garage rock, psychedelic stuff, 60s folk stuff. It was just this limitless realm of stuff to just really be just mind blowing to me in a way that I didn't know that stuff could be that awesome. And it's never stopped being awesome to me. I've gotten interested in other stuff. I mean, I have plenty of punk stuff now, plenty of indie rock, plenty of other things, jazz and this and that. But 60s stuff it just became like the main awesome thing to me.
Yeah. Do you remember what it was that resonated with you about it? Where you started going down this rabbit hole and then just fully went and then just abandoned kind of the stuff that you had been desiring?
Well, in some ways, it comes back to that tribal social element of being in school and like being in high school and being like, oh, am I going to be hanging out with these punk kids or am I going to be hanging out with these hip hop kids or am I going to be hanging out with these heavy metal kids or am I going to be hanging out with these like, dance club kids? Oh, the kids that I'm going to be hanging out with are the sort of hippie kids and the kids that have a Led Zeppelin patch on their shirt. Who is that? What is that? What is who is Pink Floyd? That's a weird name. Like, oh, Rolling Stones. Oh yeah, I think there's a couple Rolling Stones records on my parents' shelf. That I'll check that out. It just kind of, and then that became the little friend group that you sort of inspire each other to start. Oh, you've got this record. Let me tape that off of you. So it kind of tied into having this friend group, and that also at that time, early 90s, tied into the fact that the Grateful Dead was still a thing, that you could have these adventures going to Grateful Dead concerts with your friends and then traveling, this opportunity to travel around America. Oh, somebody has access to a car. They're going to go see the Grateful Dead in Ohio and in Chicago. Who's going to fit in the car? Oh, I'll come. We have no money, but that doesn't matter. Like, we'll just eat a loaf of bread and like have this great adventure with your friends. And that was very tied into the 60s thing because of the Grateful Dead and the opportunity for traveling and adventure and knowing more about this music. So that was kind of part of the gateway. It wasn't just that, it wasn't just like that The Wall is this awesome album and I have to get more Pink Floyd records or something. It was the opportunity to make new friends and be part of a scene like that. although I ended up getting much more into it than anybody that I ever met. The people that I was friends with, even to this day, I don't know anybody who has the interest in the deeper levels of it that I was always drawn to. They'd be listening to Dark Side of the Moon, and I'd be like, well, wait, who is this Sid Barrett guy? Like, what are these early Pink Floyd records about? Like,
Right.
oh, he has solo records? Let me hear those. Oh, who is this band, the 13th Floor Elevators? The psychedelic sounds? I want to hear that. What is that all about? Who are Love? Who are Moby Grape? Jefferson Airplane. Yeah, they have that great song Somebody to Love, but what was their next album like? What was the album after that like? What was the album before that like? And also, this all coincided with this being the 90s where everybody's record collection got dumped in the trash because CDs were the thing. So all of those records, all those 60s records were just totally valueless to most people, and they could just be had for so cheap that it was the perfect era for a teenager who was curious who had no money. If you had $2, you could go buy a Creedence Clearwater record, a Rolling Stones record. Every single thing under the sun was from that era was $2, $3, $4. And it was just, I bought a lot of things that I didn't like. I would end up with records that I didn't like, but it was very easy, very cheap to have a free reign to explore that whole realm and end up with, I own every Led Zeppelin record, I have every Cream record, every Traffic record, because they were just dirt cheap. If I had $2, I could go to the record store, flip through and be like, oh, here's a Dylan record I don't have, $2. Why not?
Yeah. So there's an obsessiveness to this too, as well? Like beyond just like, hey, this is my friend group, right? You said you got into it more than others. Is there an obsessiveness? Like, what is this music or what is this kind of aesthetic doing for you, either emotionally or, what's it doing inside where like it really becomes something that encompasses you or pulls you in? Does that make sense?
Well, you talked about describing your interview process as wanting to get into this more therapeutic level of somebody's, and this relates very much, that kind of question, I think for me operates on a few different levels. Because first of all, a lot of this stuff, the interest in communism and the interest in the 60s is a way for me to try to understand my parents. It's a way for me to try to figure out what is this mystical, magical realm that they were always talking about, that they always, especially my father, because he's such a storyteller, was always saying, oh, the 60s were the greatest time, and, really like that, which is the kind of thing that pisses off some people, makes some people want to turn into punk rockers and be like, fuck the 60s, I'm so sick of hearing about this bullshit. But for me, it was like, it just fascinated me from that parental standpoint of coming from these very countercultural parents, that made it seem like there was this big secret that I wanted to find out more about. And hearing those records and learning about that stuff was kind of a way to figure out what was, and because the 80s were so antithetical to the 60s, it was like this very hidden world that to discover that world was just tearing off this curtain on reality and exposing this other lost culture that you just did not know existed from my very cloistered 80s perspective on things. Because my parents didn't it wasn't like they were record collectors or cultural nerds in that way. It's not like though I was exposed to that stuff necessarily. It was more like they had a couple of those records around the house. Maybe they had a couple of Robert Crumb comics around the house. And it was like, oh, this is like weird, grown-up, dirty stuff that I know I'm not supposed to look at, but it has something to do with like pot. It has something to do with acid, or what is all this stuff? And my dad was also he always ride motorcycles. He was always a motorcycle rider, so it was kind of
Really?
like the kind of yeah, he would like ride me to school on the motorcycle, and we would go on motorcycle trips together and stuff. So that also tied into this 60s thing of like Easy Rider and kind of Grateful Dead, Hell's Angels stuff. It was like this way of trying to get closer to my parents or try to understand my parents. And then it was also as a tribal identity for myself, as a way that it was like for a kid who was kind of small and scrawny and not athletic and very, I was just into drawing and into comic books, very nerdy. I was not a jock at all. I was not like a kind of aggressive or attractive or, alpha male type kid at all. Obviously, I'm a comic book guy, and I felt, I guess, I must have felt that the '60s stuff and the hippie kind of identity was something that wasn't about that kind of macho aggressiveness, which is maybe why I didn't want to be part of the heavy metal kids hanging out or the punk kids hanging out or the hip hop kids hanging out. All of that stuff had an aggression to it that not only did I not relate to, or I didn't feel an attraction to that, but I couldn't have really seen myself having an identity in that group. None of those kids would have thought I was cool. I couldn't, I couldn't authentically be one of those tough kids. But at the time, the hippie thing seemed like something where it's like, oh, I can be a genuine member of this community just because I'm creative and I can grow my hair out and, you know, I can just, so that I think feeds into it too, that it was just the kind of kid that I was, that I could like see myself being part of hanging out with other kids that were like that because of the lack of like kind of macho aggression in that maybe.
Yeah. When you say that you were trying to understand your parents better, do you think that was a conscious thing? Or do you think you just meant that like there was a, I don't know, some feeling in you where you wanted to try to figure out them, and it wasn't a conscious like, you know what, I'm going to figure out my parents by listening to this music. It was more of just like you're listening to it and you're like, oh, I think I understand them a little better. I guess as a sub question to that, could you talk to your parents? Could you ask them questions?
Somewhat. I don't know. It certainly, I guess it really wasn't conscious. It was, yeah, if you put it that way, it wasn't really conscious, but I can just look back on it now. And it really would have, it would have been, like an interest in my own, background in some ways. And all, I don't know. It's, and it's not something that I would have even been able to really talk to them about, because I didn't want my parents to know that I was smoking pot. I didn't want my parents to tell me what records to listen to, and I very quickly outstripped their knowledge of the '60s. They had very basic knowledge of, oh, they liked the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and
Right.
Bob Dylan, but they certainly would never have heard, 90% of the stuff that I was starting to listen to. They would never have heard whatever, even I don't know, they didn't have any Jimi Hendrix records, or they certainly wouldn't have had Love or, even Pink Floyd or any of that stuff. Even that seemed like it was a bit weirder and outside of their, most of the records that they had were like jazz and blues and folk records. So I certainly had exposure to things that I take for granted in terms like knowing Woody Guthrie, knowing Pete Seeger. It shocks me when I meet people that don't know. Well, I was like, doesn't everybody grow up listening to Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and that stuff to me that I just take for granted. So I was steeped in that stuff, but I wasn't really. Yeah, it's not like I could ask my parents like which are the best Beatles records or stuff like that, because they just weren't that interested in it. They had some of those records.
But just in general, like, could you talk to your parents? Could you ask them about did it even make sense for you to be like, oh, I wonder what they were like growing up or anything like that? Because that stuff, like, there was just a strict separation. And my parents, I think, are kind of the same generation as your parents, but there was a strict separation between us. They were authority figures. And while there was love in the household, it wasn't like it was just waspy or anything like that, or a little bit, but like it wasn't just bloodless. But they were definitely authority figures, and there was a separation. It didn't even feel right or appropriate to ask them certain things.
Yeah, I guess there's always some barrier there. I feel like I have to kind of carve out some privacy for myself because my parents, we grew up in a railroad tenement apartment with no doors. There were no rooms. There was no separation between rooms at all. The bathroom had a door, and that was it. And that was the way a lot of these tenement apartments in the neighborhood were. And there was always this sense of like, I don't want to hear about this stuff. Like these very liberal parents that are always, even from a fairly young age, going to be like, are you sure you know how sex works? Like, because the man puts his penis into the vagina, and then I'm just like, shut the fuck up! Like, stop telling me about this. I'm so sick of hearing about this. Like, it's like, and my dad would just be like, well, if you ever want to experiment with mushrooms, we could take some together and we could go. And I was just like, no, like, leave me the fuck alone. Like, I don't want, it's too intimate. It's like, I need my own space to like find my own way of connecting to these things and like not have to share that journey with my parents. That's just too gross and too like crosses too many boundaries into the private sphere that I need to have for my own space and my own identity. So rather than them being removed authority figures, it was more like I had to hear all the time about, the equality of the sex, women's liberation, civil rights, anti-racism, stuff to the extent that like I said before, I was kind of like unprepared to deal with the world as it was. I just kind of like assumed that was, that everybody would be seeing each other as equals, and that I remember it was like very shocking to me that I don't know, being in school and like maybe the black kids, didn't want to hang out with me. They had like they were like a group of black friends that where I was made to feel like the outside, and I was like, no, but what about the civil rights movement or something? We're all supposed to be equal or something. This kind of thing of like ignoring that there are different races, or just being raised in this like sort of very stereotypical kind of a. I never watched Sesame Street, but it was this very Sesame Street, rainbow of everybody's all in this together. And yes. I kind of really wasn't prepared to go out into a world where people weren't really all in it together, and I was just like this like unprepared nerd.
Yes, I get it. There's the kind of like our parents' generation was the kind of like liberal. Hey, there's no differences.
Yeah.
As opposed to a kind of a more progressive that I've come to in adulthood. It's like, no, there are differences, and it's okay that there are differences, and you should acknowledge the differences, as opposed to pretending like everyone's doing the same thing or the same kind of person or whatever.
Yeah, and these things are probably never really definitive, because it probably goes back and forth, and it's probably different from one family to the next, and from one individual to the next. I don't know if. Yeah, I have like these whatever our modern perspective on what is the most inclusive or the most progressive or the most conscientious way of being and interacting. I don't feel as though that is definitive and will stand for the next 40 years. I think these things are going to shift, and what we think of as the right way to be and the wrong way to be. I've seen these things shift a number of times over my lifetime, and I expect they'll continue to shift, assuming there is a future. And but that like idea of being able to ask my parents directly rather than discovering on my own. I've done comic books that are like asking my dad to tell me, well, like what happened when you escaped from the draft, or like what were you doing to hustle up money off the books on the Lower East Side in the late 60s, or what, so I have these comic books that are sort of like the stories that my dad tells comics. And then I have my mom's perspective, where it's like, what's my mom's version of this story? So but that's kind of just been later in life. I didn't, as a kid, and even to some degree to this day, I mean, my dad's 87 and my mom's 83, so they're really getting up there. But I'm usually like just sick of hearing my dad talk. He always wants to, making the comics was kind of a way for me to be like, well, at least I can make some money out of this if I have to hear him talk about, his, just boasting about all of his adventures and his grand experiences. I'm like, I've had to put up with this shit all my life. At least I can like make this into some entertainment form by making a comic out of it.
Well, I mean, we're right at the end, so that does bring up, the very main question of the show, which is, how do you figure out your existential path in all of this? And also, can I add that you are born on the on the edge of like the neoliberal period, right? You're born into like New York being at its lowest point. The like, what is it? Ford to,
Yeah.
I forget the headline, but it's like Ford's basically saying New York drop dead. You know, it's decaying, but at the same time, you also have like still a vibrant art scene. You have the downtown New York art scene. I mean, you're a child at that point, so I'm sure it's not like you're not going to CBGBs, but like it's still there. You have all of this stuff going on, and your parent. Like, how do you navigate this all to figure out what you want to do with your life?
Man, just loved it so much. My parents loved the Lower East Side. I loved the Lower East Side. And we all have this intense nostalgia for a lost world that really, even by, say, 1983 or 84, it starts to be a bit more of a lost world. But yeah, because I was born in late 75, so I really wasn't around in 75. I was born in November, so 1976 is really like my first year on Earth. So I feel like I'm lucky enough to have caught a little bit of the tail end of the 70s on the Lower East Side. And although, of course, people say it was crime-ridden and dangerous and all of these things, I think anybody who experienced that era, whether as a grown-up or a kid, has this nostalgia for it because it was a neighborhood and you did know your neighbors. You knew the people that were hanging out on the street. It was very much like Sesame Street, I guess. And, there's your Oscar the Grouch, and there's your, the way that you would imagine, say, maybe some kind of stereotypical vision of what Harlem might have been like in a certain era where people all kind of know each other and there's a community. And it was separate from you really, yeah, you did have this sense that you were kind of in a separate world from the rest of culture or something. And there was a great pride in that. And that, that we are from the Lower East Side and stuff. But it's funny because like nowadays, everybody would just say that that's the East Village, this whole area, and the Lower East Side is considered something further down. But everybody in the neighborhood always called it the Lower East Side when I was young. Yeah, when you meant like how do you navigate that, it never seemed negative. The poverty that I guess would be considered poverty that I grew up in, like never having new clothes, never having a haircut. We basically almost never went to restaurants. That was very rare. I never flew any. I didn't fly any. I wasn't in an airplane until I was like 20 or something. A complete assumption of a certain level of poverty where you just assume you're not spending any money and you're not living to make money, that nobody in the neighborhood really had a job or those kind of ambitions of making money. It was a neighborhood to go to live cheap. And that, I think, does feed into my artistic existence in the sense that I was able to graduate college without the first few years of my post-college life. It was not a shock to me to live on cans of beans and not have any money, to go to an open mic night where there's a 1 drink minimum for $5 to buy a cup of tea, and I have to like avoid making eye contact with the waitress so that I don't have to spend, because I don't have the $5 for the cup of tea. And that was just the way I grew up. And it really helped me progress as an artist and as a person who ended up making music and going on tour, because I think a lot of my early touring experiences were what a lot of bands might consider a sure sign that you failed and you need to do something else with your life. But to me, that level of failure was that was normal. That was, oh, we don't have a place to sleep and we're sleeping in the car, and, I'm just eating a 99-cent loaf of bread and a can of beans from the supermarket. And that was all kind of, it was like going on tour following the Grateful Dead with my high school friends, was part of that narrative too. That was the way that I would travel with my father if we went on motorcycle trips together, and we would just, carry around a tent and just put the tent up somewhere out of sight, and you just had this assumption that you were not spending any money. There was there was just this assumption that money was not part of the picture. You do everything without spending money, and maybe you work a little bit to make some money, but then you just live as long as you can off of that money. So that really informed my transition into going to Grateful Dead shows as a teenager, because I was kind of used to traveling like that. And then that really very smoothly later in life, in my early 20s, morphed into me going on tour with my brother as my bass player. And we were just of that culture. So it was a perfect education for how to be a touring musician, how to be a starving artist. There was nothing, it wasn't like coming down in the world and having to face the difficult sacrifices of, can I really live as an artist? It was no different from how I'd been living my entire life anyway.
Okay, then last question. Was it always comics? Was it always music from the start? Or was there something where you're like, I have to do something else? Did anything else come into the picture? Or was it always like, here's the thing, I'm just going to follow this out?
Comic books, definitely, from as far back as I can remember. Was always into comic books, always loved reading comic books, wanted to draw, wanted to make comic books. That was just a big through line from my whole life. I mean, when I pulled out those Ninja Turtles comics from when I was like 11 or something, right next to them on the shelf is the 5 issues that I drew at age 11, 12 of the Samurai Squirrels, which was my own Ninja Turtles ripoff comic. So I was making all of these comics at a very young age, and music was not part of it at all. Music was never something that I was intending to do or planning to do with my life. My friends were musicians, but I was not one of them. I was the guy who was drawing all the time, and I was going to try to draw all the time so I could get to be as good as Jack Kirby or Robert Crumb. And I knew that the way to do that was if you drew all the time, you could get to that level. And that was my path. That was like definitely my chosen path. I was a literature major in college because I just figured there was nothing that they'd be able to teach me about drawing, because I had this philosophy that the only secret to it is the more you draw, the better you get. So if you want to get good, you just draw a lot all the time. Nobody's going to give you any shortcuts beyond that. So I might as well learn something else in school, like literature, so that I at least have some kind of academic credentials for the jobs that I'll probably have to get as a grown up. Maybe I'll have to be a teacher. Maybe I'll have to, I don't know, something. I could use those skills to, maybe I would be an editor or I don't know what. But it seemed like it made sense for me to have some kind of academic credentials rather than just an art degree. Plus, being an art major, I would have had to do painting, sculpture, pottery, photography. I had no interest in any of that stuff. All I wanted to do was draw so that I could get really good at drawing, so that I could make really great comic books. That was it. And then it was really just after I graduated college that I started getting interested in making songs, and that all came from Daniel Johnston, from my brother Jack and I starting to get really into Daniel Johnston. And Daniel Johnston came from my obsession with Syd Barrett, because Syd Barrett was just this mysterious figure of the 60s. Like, oh, he started Pink Floyd, and then he went insane, and then he made these weird solo records, and nobody knows where he is now. And that was just, the mystique of that was so addictive and magnetic to me. And of course, there was no internet, and you just heard these rumors. Like, so anything that I could find out about Syd Barrett, or any recordings I could get of Syd Barrett, became just something I was really personally super interested in. And at some point I read some article that, like, oh, there's this American guy, Daniel Johnston, and he's kind of like an American version of Syd Barrett. He's kind of an eccentric songwriter with mental issues, and his stuff is kind of, cracked in a certain way. And I was like, oh, if this guy's like Syd Barrett, I have to hear him. So that kind of led to, later I had a friend in college who had a Daniel Johnston album, and I was like, oh, I've read about that guy. I really want to hear this. And then, eventually opened this door in my mind, like, oh, that was so mind-blowing. There's a way to make music, a way to make songs that is so direct, and you just hit record on a tape recorder, and you can just make these very raw things. And my brother and I just really fell in love with that idea, and we started making up songs and started playing some songs together in our bedroom. And after college, and I started hanging out at the open mic and making up, just these solo acoustic songs. And then that kind of gathered a momentum on its own and turned into what became my life. But it was very much not the path that, just making comic books was really my path.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining me.
Cool. Thanks for the very interesting interview.
Yeah, I was so glad to talk to you. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, bye, oh, bye.